He didn't settle her account because he was a decent man. He settled it because Spratt's voice, that wet, deliberate drawl that never quite finished a sentence without a pause to let the cruelty sink in, was ruining the only decent cup of tea Knox had tasted in 4 months, and he'd run out of patience somewhere around the 3rd repetition of the word owing. The trading post in Dunmore sat at the edge of a frozen creek at the base of the Palliser Range, a low-slung building of rough-hewn spruce logs that smelled permanently of tallow damp wool and the particular desperation of people who had no other option. Knox came down from his ridge twice a year, sometimes 3 times if a hard winter pushed him. He didn't come for company, he came for lamp oil, dried beans, and the kind of silence that could only exist when you were very far from anywhere anyone wanted to be. He'd been standing at the far end of the plank counter for 6 minutes. Long enough to drink half a cup of tea gone lukewarm, when the commotion started behind the partition wall. "The account is $64, Mrs. Ashford." Spratt's voice floated over the partition with the ease of a man who enjoyed saying numbers out loud. "Your husband's name, your husband's debt. I don't make the arithmetic." Knox didn't turn around. He watched the steam rise off his cup. "I understand what it says." The woman's voice was quiet and controlled, but something behind it was pulling very tight. "I'm asking for 30 days. Enough time to sell the remaining timber rights on the North Quarter. The North Quarter reverts to my holding on December 1st if the account isn't settled." A chair scraped. "That's 11 days from now, Mrs. Ashford. I don't see 30 days anywhere in that." A pause. "Then let me work it off, I can. The only work I have on offer isn't the kind you're thinking of." Knox set his cup down. The sound it made against the plank counter was small and flat, but it was the only sound in the room at that moment, and it carried. He walked around the partition. Ivy Ashford was standing in the center of the small back room, her hands clasped in front of her coat, her jaw set so hard the muscle in her cheek was jumping. She was not crying. Knox noted that specifically. She was the opposite of crying. She was the kind of still that happens when a person has been pushed to the edge of a very high place and is using every available resource to keep their feet. Spratt stood behind his ledger desk, a heavy, grey-jowled man, with the kind of eyes that were always running a quiet calculation behind whatever expression he was wearing. He looked at Knox the way a man looks at weather coming in. $64, Knox said. "Her account, not yours." "I know whose account it is." Knox reached inside his heavy oilskin coat and pulled out the canvas pouch he'd been meaning to deposit at the assay office in the spring. He set it on Spratt's ledger desk. The pouch was heavy enough that it bent the page it landed on. "Weigh it. The dust will cover it. If it doesn't, I'll make up the difference in coin." Spratt stared at the pouch, then at Knox. "You're buying her debt." "I'm buying the quiet." Knox glanced at the woman. She was staring at him not with relief, but with a sharp, evaluating suspicion, as though she were trying to determine which direction the new threat was coming from. "We're done here," Knox said, to Spratt, not to her, and walked back out to the counter to collect his salt and oil. He heard her come through the partition behind him. He didn't wait. He paid for his goods, loaded the pack into the cargo sled, and stepped out into the November cold. The sky over the Palliser Range was the color of old pewter, heavy and low, promising snow before dark. Knox checked the harnessing on his 2 dogs, pulled the sled rope taut, and headed for the trailhead. He had gone perhaps a 1/4 mile into the spruce when he heard it. Footsteps in the frozen crust, deliberate, evenly paced. He stopped. Behind him, perhaps 40 feet back on the trail, Ivy stood in the tree shadow. She had no pack. She had no snowshoes. She wore a wool coat that might have been adequate in October, and boots better suited to a kitchen floor than a mountainside in November. She was shivering. He could see it from 40 feet away, but her chin was level, and her eyes were steady. Go back to Dunmore, Knox said. I owe you $64, she said. You don't owe me anything. I threw that money at a problem I didn't want to listen to anymore. It's gone. Turn around. I don't take charity. I know you don't. I don't care. She said nothing else. She just stood there. Knox turned back to his sled and kept walking. He told himself she would stop when the trail began to climb. She didn't stop when the trail began to climb. He told himself she would stop when the temperature dropped another 5 degrees with the elevation, and the light started draining out of the sky. She didn't stop. He checked over his shoulder when he reached the first switchback. She was still there, a dark shape against the white, moving slower, now her arms wrapped across her chest, her breath coming in visible bursts. She stumbled on an ice-covered route and went down hard on one knee, and he watched her, waited, to see if that would be the end of it. She got up. She adjusted her coat, found her footing, and kept walking. Knox swore under his breath, something he almost never did. He locked the sled brake, handed the lead dog a chunk of dried meat to keep him occupied, and walked back down the trail. When he reached her, her lips had a faint blue tinge at the corners that he didn't like at all. You're going to freeze to death on this trail, he said. This mountain is 4 hours in good conditions. You're not in good conditions. I'm aware. Her teeth were chattering hard enough that the words came out in pieces, but her expression didn't waver. I work my debts. $64 is real money. I don't walk away from real money. He looked at her for a moment. The thin coat, the kitchen boots, the stubborn freezing set of her face, and felt an annoyance that had a strange weight to it, heavier than the situation warranted. Can you walk fast? I can walk whatever speed you need. Don't make promises on a mountain, he said. He turned and walked back up to the sled, and when he reached it, he did not invite her up. He just stopped and waited until she'd climbed into the cargo sled, on top of the supply bundles, and then he pulled the spare spruce bough blanket from under the bench and dropped it over her without a word. The trail up was 4 hours in weather like this, and Knox didn't speak for any of them. She didn't ask him to. By the time the cabin came into view, a low, solid shape of notched spruce log crouched against a granite outcropping, with a woodshed lashed to one side. The snow that had been threatening all day had finally arrived. It came sideways, driven by a northeast wind off the range, and it was the kind of snow that meant business. Knox got the dogs settled in their kennel run and came back to the sled to find Ivy had already unloaded herself and was standing at the cabin door with 2 of his supply parcels in her arms, waiting. He opened the door. She went inside. The cabin was cold enough to see their breath, cold enough that the water in the kettle had filmed over with a thin skin of ice. Knox built the fire, up from coals, while Ivy stood near the hearth, not in his way, not asking where anything was, just waiting for there to be enough heat to make sense of her next movement. He lit the lantern. He filled the kettle from the water barrel, which was only 3/4 frozen. He pointed at the loft ladder. She climbed it without a word. He settled himself on the bench, near the hearth, with his rifle across his knees, staring into the fire. He fell asleep, listening to the storm work itself against the cabin roof, and to the low, steady sound of her breathing somewhere above him in the dark. In the morning, Knox woke to real heat. Not the stingy heat of a fire fed once and abandoned, but a solid, pushing warmth that said the fire had been tended through the night by someone paying attention. He opened his eyes. The cabin smelled of coffee and something frying, and the light through the single window was the pale, flat white of new snow. Ivy was sitting on the low stool near the hearth. She was wearing his spare wool shirt. It hung nearly to her knees, and her own coat was draped over the chair back to dry. In her lap was the heavy canvas pack Knox used to haul trapline gear the one whose main seam had finally given out 2 weeks prior after 3 years of hard use. He'd been stitching it closed, with twine, every morning. Knowing the twine would give, planning to replace the whole pack when he got back to Dunmore. Ivy had it open across her knees. In her right hand was the heavy curved needle from his sewing kit, and she was running it through the canvas with a short, controlled pull that said she'd done this before. The thread wasn't the twine he'd left in the needle. She'd found his waxed linen, the good stuff, reserved for boot repair, and was laying down a flat-felled seam along the burst section that would be stronger than the original stitching had ever been. Knox sat up from the bench. She didn't look up. Her fingers moved with the kind of economy that doesn't come from careful thinking. It comes from the body knowing before the mind does. When she pulled the needle through, he could see the skin at the back of her knuckles was raw, beginning to crack from the combination of cold and the resistance of heavy canvas. She tied off the thread, bit it clean, and ran her thumb along the finished seam. Then she looked up at him. "Your stores are in the wrong order," she said, her voice entirely matter-of-fact. "The dried beans are against the north wall. That's the cold wall. They'll go hard as river rock by February. I moved them to the south shelf." A pause. "The coffee was nearly out. I rationed what's left. 1 pot a day until you can get more." Knox looked at the mended pack. He looked at her hands. He looked at the south shelf, which had been a jumble of random tins and sacks for the better part of 2 years, and now stood in careful order by size and weight. He couldn't form a single word. Ivy stood and held out the pack. "It'll hold for the season. The seam is doubled where the weight sits." He took it. He turned it over in his hands. She was right. It was better than factory work. "I don't take charity," she said again, softer this time, as though reminding herself as much as him. "Room and board costs labor. The $64 is a separate account. I'll keep track." A pause. "I found a strip of birch bark in your kindling box." That afternoon he watched her nail the birch bark to the wall beside the hearth. She made her first mark in charcoal, small and precise, and stepped back to look at it. The most deliberate thing he had ever seen. They built a rhythm out of necessity, the way people on a mountain always do. Knox left before light to check his trap lines, 2 miles of snares and leg holds strung through the spruce, and poplar stands below the ridge. He came back at dusk with whatever the night had provided: marten, mink, the occasional lynx, once a heavy beaver from the creek that had carved itself under the ice. He dropped the carcasses on the work table without ceremony. Ivy didn't flinch. She picked up the skinning knife, and she worked. Her hands, already raw from the canvas and the cold, grew tougher. Blisters healed into calluses. She learned where he kept things without asking, learned to read the weather from the way the spruce trees moved, learned to bank the fire to last exactly as long as needed. The cabin, which had been a cold box of a place night, became something night. Warm, ordered, smelling of pine and rendered fat and good strong coffee. He found himself coming home faster. He didn't examine the reason for a long time. One evening in early December, a wind came off the range like a freight train, and the temperature dropped so fast frost crawled up the inside of the window in the time it took to eat supper. Ivy was at the work table, working fat into a pair of his worn trapline mittens, and Knox was cleaning his rifle, and neither of them had spoken in an hour, when she said, "My husband's name was Wren." Knox stopped moving the cleaning cloth. He waited. "Everyone said it was a falling tree," Ivy said, not looking up from the mittens. "That's what the logging company report said. That's what Spratt said when he came to the house 3 days later with the account ledger." Her hands kept moving, working fat into the worn seams, slow and steady. Wren had found something in the camp's supply accounts. Spratt was holding the supply contract for the logging company that season. Wren found discrepancies. Shortfalls in the weight of goods delivered against what Spratt was billing. $112 over the course of 2 seasons. A pause. He told me on a Friday evening that he was going to bring it to the company foreman. Knox was very still. He died on Saturday morning. She set the mitten down on her knee, under a perfectly clear sky. On a slope he'd worked every day for 3 months, without a single bad step. She looked up. The firelight caught her eyes, dark and dry and absolutely certain. I'm not saying I can prove it. I'm saying I know the arithmetic. She held Knox's gaze without any ask in her expression. She wasn't looking for his pity or his outrage. She was simply telling him the truth, because they were 2 people alone on a mountain in the dark, and she was done carrying it by herself. The $64 Spratt claims Wren owed him, I don't believe $1 of it is real. But the land is real, the North Quarter, with the timber rights. That's what he wants. Her chin lifted slightly. Wren kept his own field notebook. I found it sewn into the lining of his work coat when I was clearing the house. Spratt doesn't know it exists. Knox looked at her for a long moment. He picked up his cleaning cloth and drove it through the rifle barrel. I know, he said quietly. It was enough. She nodded once, picked up the mitten, and kept working. The storm raged against the cabin. Neither of them spoke again that night, but the silence that settled around them was a different kind than before. It was the kind that meant something had been put down and wouldn't need to be picked up again. March came, and with it the particular restlessness of a mountain losing its snow from the bottom up. The birch bark tally on the wall was nearly full. Ivy announced the remaining balance, $18, over breakfast one morning as though reading the weather. Knox stared at his coffee. The trail down to Dunmore had been passable for 2 weeks. The question sat between them, like a third person at the table, and neither of them named it. He was in the woodshed working on a cracked toboggan stanchion when the dogs started in. Not the short, familiar bark of a known approach, but the rolling, sustained alarm of strangers. Knox stepped out. 2 men on horseback coming up the packed trail through the spruce. He recognized the horses before he recognized the men, Dunmore town stock. The man in front was heavyset, riding with the slightly sideways posture of someone not comfortable in a saddle. Spratt's hired man. He'd seen him loitering around the trading post on and off for 2 years. The one behind was younger and unknown, but the rifle angled across his saddle horn was not unknown. Knox went back into the woodshed. He came out with the double-barreled shotgun his grandfather had brought west from Ontario. He cracked it to check the loads, snapped it shut, and walked to the center of the yard. The 2 men pulled up. "Hell of a climb," the heavyset man said, and spat into the snow. "What do you need?" Knox said. "Spratt sends his regards. Turns out there was an oversight in the account review." He pulled a folded paper from his coat. "Additional charges, going back to last summer. Supply fees Wren Ashford for before his accident." He smiled at the word accident in a way that said he knew exactly what the word was doing. "Adds up to another $40. With interest, call it 52. Behind Knox, the cabin door opened. He didn't turn. "Go inside, Ivy." She didn't go inside. She stepped off the porch into the snow beside him, and when he finally glanced at her, he saw she'd picked up the long-handled hatchet from beside the chopping block. She held it down at her side, easy and without drama. "That paper is paper," she said. Her voice was flat and cold and clear as the winter air. "It isn't a debt. You go back to Dunmore and you tell Spratt, the North Quarter land is going to the lands office before the spring survey closes, with a complete accounting of what he's been billing the logging company against what he's actually been delivering." Wren kept detailed notes. A pause. "I have them?" The heavy-set man's smile dropped. Knox raised the shotgun and fired, not at the men. Into the spruce stand to their left. The charge hit an ice-seethed trunk and the crack of it rolled across the clearing like a thunderclap. Both horses screamed and reared back on their haunches. Knox leveled the second barrel at the heavy-set man's chest. "Get off my ridge," Knox said. "If Spratt puts her name on another piece of paper, I'll come down that mountain and testify to everything I've watched him do in that trading post to every government man I can find between here and Edmonton, and I have a long memory." The heavy-set man fought his horse under control. He looked at Knox's eyes and found exactly what he needed to find in them. They left. Knox stood in the yard until the sound of their horses faded into the spruce. He lowered the gun. Smoke drifted off the barrel and dissolved in the cold air. Behind him, Ivy set the hatchet down, quietly, and then she didn't move for a moment. Knox turned. She was staring at the treeline where the riders had gone. Her arms crossed tight across her ribs. A single line of moisture cut down her cheek, quick and without warning, and she pressed her lips together against whatever was trying to come out. "He'll make more paper," she said. "Barely sound. He'll keep." "He won't." Knox stepped closer. "He's a coward who trades in ledgers. When the ledger stops working, he doesn't have anything." "The notes I said I have." She looked up at him. "I do have them. I wasn't bluffing." "I know." She pulled in a breath, steadied herself, then she reached up and pressed the back of her wrist against her cheek, brisk and unsentimental, as though filing the moment away. Knox reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his folding knife. He held it out, handle first. She looked at it, then at him. "The bark's full," he said. "You'll need something to start a new piece." A breath went out of her, shaky, barely there, but her hand came out and took the knife. April came with mud and meltwater, and the first light that actually carried warmth in it. The trail to Dunmore had been open for 10 days when Ivy announced she was going down. Knox set down his mug. "No." She turned from the window to look at him. "No. Spratt is still down there. I know he is." She came away from the window and stood in front of him, her arms at her sides. She was wearing the canvas jacket she'd bought off, a passing freighter in January and tailored to fit herself, taking in the shoulders and shortening the sleeves with the same precise hands that had mended his pack in December. She was not the woman who had followed him up this trail in kitchen boots in November. He knew that the problem was that he was having trouble imagining the mountain without her in it, and he'd been careful not to examine that problem too directly. "I have Wren's field notebook," she said. "I have the tally I've been keeping here. I have enough to file a proper land claim at the lands office before the spring survey season closes, and I want to do it in person." She looked at him steadily. "I'm going." He rubbed his jaw. He thought about the boot print she'd left in the snow that first night, getting back up off her knee on a dark mountain trail. "Monday," he said, "I take the dogs and the sled for the supplies run. You come with me?" She didn't smile, but the set of her shoulders changed, very slightly, in a way he'd spent 4 months learning to read. Dunmore in April was mud and meltwater, and the same grey wood buildings looking somewhat diminished now that a season had finally arrived. Knox pulled the sled to a halt in front of the trading post and set the brake. He came around to her side. She stepped down into the mud without taking his hand. But as she passed him, her shoulder pressed briefly against his arm, deliberate and unhurried, and she kept walking. He stood there for a second. 30 minutes, he said. She went into the trading post. Knox went to the outfitter, 2 buildings, down to sell his winter pelts. He spent the remaining time standing in the shadow of the outfitter's eave, watching the trading post door, his hand resting loosely near the revolver at his hip. When Ivy came back out, she carried a canvas sack over one shoulder. In her other hand was a folded paper with an official stamp pressed into it that Knox could read from across the street. The lands office clerk's seal, dark and square and final. Behind her, Spratt stood in his doorway. His face was the color of old tallow, and he was watching her go with the particular expression of a man who has just had something taken from him by legal means and has no further moves to make. When Ivy reached the street and turned toward the sled, he went back inside and shut his door. Ivy set the canvas sack in the cargo sled. She turned. She had been inside that trading post for less than 15 minutes, but Knox had spent 4 months learning to read her face, and what he saw in it now was not relief and not triumph. It was something older than both, the specific quiet of a person who has set down something they have been carrying too long, and feels the strange unfamiliar lightness of having nothing in their arms. He untied the dogs. She climbed into the sled. He walked to the front of the team and got them moving, and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed to be said on a muddy April street with the sun finally showing itself over the Palliser Range. The trail back up the mountain was slower than usual, the mud soft and treacherous in the spring thaw. They stopped twice to rest the dogs. Ivy sat in the sled, with her knees pulled up and her eyes on the spruce line above, and at some point, Knox could not have said exactly when, she reached over the sideboard and placed her hand over his on the guide rope. He looked down at her hand. Her knuckles were still slightly rough from the winter's work, the last of the cold weather cracks just beginning to heal. He turned his palm over and held on. That evening, Ivy took the strip of birch bark off the nail beside the hearth. Knox stood in the doorway and watched her hold it for a moment, reading the careful rows of charcoal tallies, every kettle of water hauled up from the creek, every hide fleshed clean, every pot of beans that had kept them both from finding out how unpleasant a hard winter scurvy truly was. Then she leaned forward and held the bark to the fire. It caught instantly, a bright, clean flare that lasted only a few seconds, before the whole thing collapsed into nothing and drifted up the chimney in small grey curls of ash. Ivy straightened. She turned around. Knox was still in the doorway, with his hat in his hand, looking at the empty nail on the log wall. "It's settled," she said. "It's settled," he agreed. He came the rest of the way into the cabin. The door swung shut behind him. Outside, the mountain was making its spring sounds, ice cracking in the creek, something moving in the spruce canopy, the low, far-off cry of a hawk riding the warming air over the ridge, the kind of sounds that said the long winter was finally fully done. Knox reached out. His thumb found the line of her jaw, rough against her skin. "You don't owe me anything, Ivy," he said. "Not a day's work, not a dollar, nothing at all." She looked up at him, at the deep lines around his eyes, the scars on his chin, the face of a man who had spent 12 years building a life around needing no one, and who was standing in his own cabin, looking at her like she was something he hadn't known he was missing until she walked into it. "Stay because you want to," he said. The last of the winter's armor came down. Not with drama, but with the ordinary simplicity of something being placed exactly where it belonged. She reached up and took hold of the lapels of his oilskin coat with both hands. "I already filed the land claim," she said. "North Quarter in my name." A pause. "Your ridge is in the quarter next to it." He held her gaze. "Suppose that makes us neighbors," Knox said. The breath that came out of Ivy then was the first fully easy breath she'd drawn since October. Since before October. Since before a Friday evening when her husband had told her something and then walked out the door the next morning and not come back. "Suppose it does," she said. He pulled her close, and outside, the ice in the creek cracked loose at last. From the granite it had been locked against all winter, and the water underneath it ran clear and cold and free down the mountain toward the valley below, as though it had simply been waiting all this time for someone to let it go.